maybe it would be really good if you can add the name of your center after your name. So if you can rename yourself, as Dina has done, Selvi from KRCT has done, Panindra from TPO also, and I will also then rename myself. Okay. So I think we can get started. So before we get started with the discussion, I'll just go through a couple of house rules, as they say. Remember that we have interpretation in today with us on English, Spanish, and French. So make sure you're on the right channel, on the right language channel in the globe icon. And for our speakers, I would actually ask you to speak slow and clear to ensure the best interpretation. Good. So let us set the scene. Today we're discussing intergenerational trauma, which was apparently first observed in 1966 by clinicians among a number of children survivors from the Nazi Holocaust. Now, in recent years, there has been an increasing, let's say, recognition of intergenerational trauma. You will also see that it's also referred to as to secondary traumatization, transgenerational trauma, co-victimization. But basically, researchers have investigated how, unresolved trauma from the past leaves its mark on survivors' lives, which may then be transferred to family members in subsequent generation. Through both, which is the interesting part, right? There's these questions about, is it biological? Is it socially transferred? Is it social-cultural? But actually studies, they point at both behavior of the parents, so transferred from both behavior of parents and the genes the child is born with. I will actually share a list of some of these studies and resources that we're referring to today with the email that I share with all of you with the recording and the presentations, so you can check them out. So to unfold this, we actually have with us today some of our colleagues from Priva, Ecuador, CSVR, South Africa, and ACTV, Uganda, who will tell us about their experiences with this topic. But remember that this is a space for you to share insights, comments, experiences, etc. So please feel free to do so. Don't be shy. And we will leave actually some space at the end of each presentation for Q&A. And at the end, we hope to have a lively discussion with all of you. But with all of that said, I will introduce our first speaker, Sumaiya Mohamed. She's an MHPSS specialist and counseling psychologist at CSVR, South Africa. Sumaiya, you're with us?
Yes, I am.
There you go.
Right. Thank you so much, Berta.
The floor is yours.
Share screen.
Yes.
Oh, what did I do? Where did it go? Sorry. This all opened. All right, awesome. Can you guys see?
We can see the presentation, but not full screen. Now it's perfect. Yeah.
All right. So thank you so much, Berta, and for the invite. I mean, this is a topic that's really close to my heart and such an area of interest as we unpack more and more, I think, our understanding of intergenerational trauma. So, just from what Bertha had said, intergenerational trauma, transgenerational, multi-generational trauma, there's various terms. It's really referring to the way in which unresolved trauma of the past can be transferred from one generation to another unintentionally. And we note it being done through social and emotional cues, the impact of post-traumatic stress disorder and responses, and other mental health consequences which were created by what we could see as the original trauma event, in a sense. Intergenerational trauma, there's been a lot of conversation in terms of it being at the societal level. So that collective trauma experience, we think about Holocaust survivors, we think about the apartheid situation, South Africa, and conflict within countries, and that collective violence that contributes to a collective experience of trauma. And we begin to see, how it's transferred within our societies. But typically, first and foremost, system. Traumatic experiences encountered by parents have a great likelihood of influencing the well-being of their offspring. The offspring of trauma survivors or victims are often, they're not direct or current recipients of the trauma event, but are exposed through narratives of their parents' experiences, images, or even the silencing of the narrative, where the event is known within the family system, but it is not discussed. So intergenerational trauma also gives life to trauma cycles within families and societies, where the trauma is relived, regenerated, but the expression and the form may look different across time or even mimic the past. And so today, I wanted to really take you guys into a journey that I have been myself within CSVR, within the work that we do. And that was really looking at transgenerational trauma and what we saw and how we saw it play out within the families that we began working with. So I'll give you just a brief around the work that we're doing, so it sets up the context. We have been working a lot with forced migrants, for example, torture survivors, political activists from the apartheid era, from conflict within Africa over the years, and having individuals coming into South Africa and seeking out these mental health services. And the experiences of these individuals, what we noticed is we often explored the trauma event. These are individuals that at the time were ranging between the ages of like 35 to about 60. And the conversations within that space was really around, we could say, for example, we could have a source point, a trauma source point, to say this is an original trauma event in terms of sexual gender-based violence, conflict-related, or torture that was experienced. But of course, there is that potential that there was traumas that their parents had experienced and passed down. But just for today's exercise, we're going to focus on these individuals and their experience of trauma. And so the trauma event, right? So trauma itself is not the event. The trauma that we're focusing on and the stuff in terms of transgenerational trauma that's passed down is really the response to the event. And this is the psychological or the emotional injury after living through an extremely frightening or distressing event. And thereafter, we notice changes in the way that we begin to function and we begin to respond and engage with others. But a key aspect is in terms of trauma is that the experience shatters the assumptions of safety and trust. And this is really important because when we think about transgenerational trauma, we'll see how it is transferred across to future generations. So a trauma experience shifts the way that we see the world, ourselves, and others. our belief in our sense, our own vulnerability, our own capabilities are shattered. Our view of the world as safe, meaningful, an orderly place, trauma shatters that. And also I believe that human beings are kind or trustworthy, right? So these elements, core elements of how we function in the world is then shattered, and we shift to experience a sense of disorientation, confusion and fear, and a sense of distrust in the world, ourselves, and others. So this is manifested in trauma responses. And so often with the individuals that came in, this is what we would see. We'd see a sense of hypervigilance, in that survival mode, always on guard. The presentation was fearful. There's a sense of anxiety around being prepared for something bad that might happen. This kind of view of suspicion around others in the world, nothing's fair, and just not daring to trust again. We also note symptoms of avoidance around thoughts, feelings, activities, and places that would remind someone of the trauma, and through this attempting to silence the trauma narrative and in turn numb themselves and the experience. We'd often get, I just want to forget, I want to erase, and I don't want to engage with any of it. Like, can it just not be there? And what we found, then the trauma would find another way. So when we shut down our regulation systems, our processing systems on a cognitive and an emotional level, we found that the trauma would find its way to express itself and to say, something's not okay and we need to make sense of it. And so individuals would present with psychosomatic pain that is not related to any medical reason, but is more bound to a psychological pain source. And that is the trauma that is unprocessed. And then intrusive thoughts as well, such as the mind trying to process the event. And when individuals are triggered by something that brings about a trauma memory, there could be flashbacks, nightmares experience, and this disorientation in time and space as the memories take the individual back to the moment of the trauma. They feel like they're back there again, and in turn will respond with levels of fear and anxiety, and even a panic response that sits within the body. Other symptoms that we noted was isolation and withdrawal, really a disruption in the regulation system, managing emotions, a stuckness, a loss, depression and anxiety, and also feelings of shame and guilt, survivor guilt in particular. And so why am I telling you this is really important. When we think about these trauma responses in the individuals that we were working with, what we found then is we sat with that and looked at how does that impact on how they're engaging with their family, in their couple relationships, with their children. And what we noted is they often came to us worried and concerned about their children. So like I said, we had a group from 35 to 60. You have individuals that are 60 that are looking at their adult children and saying, there's substance abuse problems, there's domestic violence, kids are being bullied at school, or they are the ones that are bullying, children having delays in developmental milestones. This was regards to toddlers, for example, suicidal ideations and attempts within adolescence, difficulty in terms of connecting with others, difficulty in terms of managing emotions, a lot of anger outbursts, especially within the adolescent and toddler range. And so there was a lot of like, this is happening to my child, this is happening, can they come? We're not able to cope. And so, and in this image here, what I put, because I really like this, was the sense of, we look at, an event, right? Surviving slavery and racial violence. And then that's Ashanti's great-grandparents. And then we look at Ashanti and we're seeing abandonment issues, domestic violence, low self-esteem. But today what I want to get into is, how do we get there? What is this moment, these trauma responses in the individual that has experienced war trauma, torture, so forth? and then coming in and saying, this is happening with my child. What is this moment here that often we don't really get into and we don't really unpack? And so that really became the focus of the work that we were doing with families. And so one of the key things that came up in the work that we did was really around attachment. And so attachment theory was developed by a psychologist called John Bowlby. And it focused on relationships and bonds between people, really starting with, those primary relationships with primary caregivers. And what he speaks about is the individual. So it can be mom, dad, it can even be a granny, but whoever is the caregiver, their availability and ability to respond to an infant's needs establishes a sense of security in their children. I see a raised hand. Berta, do I continue?
Yeah, go ahead, Sumaiya. I think we'll take questions at the end. Yes.
And once the infant, kind of builds this relationship in the caregiver connecting, and they connect with each other, the infant gets to see the world as dependable, right? So it's a secure base within that relationship. And from that, they then begin to explore the world. And so within that space, we started working with a range of different people. I mean, we were working with moms who were pregnant, moms who had babies and were 4 months old sitting in the room. We were working with, your toddler range, adolescents, and even adults and parents. And so from those spaces, attachment kept on coming up, looking at the relationship between the two. And so we began exploring it. And so I'm going to give you kind of a few aspects that link to how we saw this transference of trauma happening, right? That response, that woundedness. So in utero development, what we noted, for example, with moms that were pregnant, there was moments where they were either in situations where they were highly stressed, thinking about forced migrants within a certain context. There's a number of continuous traumatic stresses, such as documentation, where am I going to get rent money, difficulties with the host community. So those stresses were there and they were present. And so in that, high cortisol levels being experienced, and this level of hypervigilance within spaces, which then impacts the infant in utero. And we noted, and from research and also working with an organization within South Africa called Ububele that focuses on parent-infant psychotherapy, the impact that that has on the child's nervous system, the child's limbic system, so the part of the brain that manages emotions. And so we see this internal regulation system, in a sense, that's being compromised already. And then we move to another level, which is really the parent-child relationship. So what we noticed with our parents, we had quite a variety. We had parents that were non-responsive to physical or emotional needs of the child. The parent was highly depressed themselves, and so did not have the capacities at that time to even respond to the child. And numbers of kind of like, the child would just be there crying, needs not being met, or being pushed over to someone else. We also found inconsistent parenting. So spaces where parents, are available and present, and then they have what we would refer to as episodes. So where they experience a trauma trigger and regress. So as I said before, with the trigger, it's re-experiencing on this cognitive level, this memory level, and responding emotionally and physically. And so parents then, being present for 2 to 3 days, but then would disappear for a week, just isolating, and the confusion that this would cause as well. Because the child would then view the parent as unreliable. Parents that were overcritical in spaces where they would interpret their children's behavior, engage with them in a very authoritative sense, and especially with adolescents feeling, I'm not good enough, nothing I do works. And then the other aspect was overly nurturing. So in the point of, kind of always being there, helicopter parenting, wanting to protect, wanting to rescue, and in turn then enabling space where the child was not, tackling certain developmental milestones that would, in a sense, promote self-esteem, self-determination, sense of worth, developmental aspects that one has to go through to develop their own competencies. So when a parent is available, sensitive, and responsive to a child's physical and emotional needs, the child is likely to experience a sense of security, a sense that the world is generally safe and that my people, right, my primary caregivers, my attachment figures are helpful when I need them. And it creates the sense of possibility that I can begin to explore my world with curiosity and confidence and engage with a sense of trust and openness with others. So when the parent proves not to be physically or emotionally available in times of need or poor at managing moments of distress for the child, what we find is the secure base, in a sense, is not established. And the child does not experience comfort, relief, or felt security. Distress elevates and doubts arise around the ability to trust. So is the world a safe place or not? Can I really trust others when I'm in need? And do I have the resources to manage my own emotions? So I want to move to the last aspect around the attachment relationship, and that is the learned behavior. So through the process of socialization, the child is an observer from a young age, learning ways of engaging. And the family is this primary source of teaching the child how to engage in the world. And it is in this arena that we learn communication skills, we learn how to cope with difficult things, we learn to regulate our emotions. How do you deal with anger? How do you deal with conflict? When you're not feeling good, what do you do? And so these relational patterns themselves are passed down within the system. When the trauma is present, it is also teaching us something, right? So these relational patterns in turn then could be maladaptive. So when the parent is feeling sad, the parent does not express, does not regulate that, or even angry, but isolates. Where there is, for example, the trauma narrative, right? And we often speak about it and how children receive that narrative. Through the reception of the narrative, it's also teaching you something. It's teaching, oh, we can talk about this and we can process it and we can have discussions about it. And it's okay. Or no, that is silence. There's shame related to that. There's things that are not okay about that. We don't talk about it. All in the while, where it is felt, whether we express it or we don't. And so what we look at is what comes out of that, right? So when we look at these attachments in forms of, in utero, the parent and child engagement, and what the child is picking up unconsciously in terms of learning, in terms of ways of being, we see that there's a space that develops where the child is learning ways of coping, but it's also speaking to avoidance. And so we go back to the original trauma responses that the individual who experienced the trauma directly experienced. Avoidance. So the avoidance of pain and distress. How do I put my own needs? I suppress them. My emotional needs, I suppress them. I put them down because I know that the space has already shown me that it's unsafe for me to express them. They're not going to be met. But there's also the element around the fragility that the child perceives the parent has. So when I come with my stuff, mom can't handle it. And we see a lot of it with our adolescent kids where I cannot express my pain. I cannot express my sense of depression because mom has hers and hers is legit because mom went through that experience. Mine's, I don't know. Mine's is not legit. And so there's this denial as well around their own experiences and guilt. Why am I feeling this way? I shouldn't. I'm not privileged, in a sense, or it's not okay for me because I wasn't there. And so this confusion and struggling with their own internal narratives without having, the story, so to say, to back them up. We find that within that space as well, when the child is navigating their own emotional needs and physical needs and not reliant on the parent, that we find family breakdown, right? So the systems of this is the parental system, this is the subsystem, and these are the different roles that gets flipped. And the children then take on parenting responsibilities, are mindful of protecting the parent, and take on this parentified role. I think as well there's a conversation around the trauma memory, right? And what we found is that at times the children would not have experience of the trauma event. I mean, they have not experienced, but they would not have, full memory, so to say, right? But through listening to their parents or other individuals that have spoken about the experience, that there's a formation of something. Right? It's not full because you were not there, but there's a formation of something. And when these narratives are not spoken about, to put the pieces together, that formation itself can be quite the gaps. Why am I feeling this way? What happened here? And there isn't a processing that happens. And this is the trickiness around the transgenerational trauma, because it's unprocessed. And so when we think about the generations that follow, what is the picture that they are sitting with? We also find that with the children, and when I'm saying children, I'm talking across the board, but mostly adolescents and the adults at this point, there's a need to connect and understand the parent and their experience. So what we saw is a craving to join, right? To go back to the attachment and the bonding. And in a sense, there was a sharing of symptoms, a sharing of experiences to gain the closeness. But because of not connected to it and a lack of conversation, that parents too were not acknowledging. So you had not been there. You don't know what you're talking about. How can you remember? You were not there. So not mindful of the conversation, and also this aspect of I am a part of this family. I am a part of you, and what that means for me, and this is part of my history. So yes, I might not have been there, but it is a part of my history. And so how do I begin to understand it? How does it begin to fit into my narrative? And so what we found then is really thinking about this woundedness, right? So we're referring it to as the trauma responses, but it is a woundedness that is passed on. And so going back to the image where I had about Ashanti, we would look then at these adults, these adolescents, and what we noted was that we found abandonment issues, low self-esteem, relationship challenges, struggling to assert themselves in spaces, not able to ask for their needs, engaging in rebellious or risky behavior to generate some response from a mom who's not, or a dad who's just not able to respond. Complex post-traumatic stress responses. And if you see, as I spoke about the trauma responses in the beginning, we've got the 3 post-traumatic stress responses, the 3 key ones, which is hypervigilance, avoidance, and intrusive memories. And we see that coming up again within our kids that we're working with, and linking it to, in a sense, their parents' experiences of this woundedness. And so in terms of the transgenerational trauma, we're looking at how the woundedness moves down, and then how, once again, we find it being replayed. And this, in essence, is the cycle that we look at. And so when we think about what trauma does, those key assumptions around the shattering of safety and trust in self, others, in the world, and we see this transference of woundedness. We know that in the children we are working with, we see again the shattering, right? So the lack of trust in self, others, in the world, and the lack of a sense of safety. And so as we began working with them, our focus was quite broad. We looked at providing individual therapy, and this was primarily for the parents at that time, and was focusing on processing their trauma experience, processing and integrating, and also bringing about a sense of awareness of how they were responding to the event, the changes that had come up in them, and symptom management to help them to reestablish their sense of control within the relationship with your therapist, within spaces that we connected with them with, to reestablish trust within people, within themselves, and to recreate. I think that was the aspect around how do you recreate and rebuild, but also getting them to unlearn and relearn. And what we found in that work, and it goes back to what I said in the beginning, was there was trauma that was passed down to them from previous generations. And so we look at that layering across time. And like I said, we were just focusing on the families that were in front of us, but it was coming down a long line. It did not just start here, but really went back to a number of historical traumas. The other layer that we worked on, and an organization in South Africa does really good work on this, and they provide training, is the Ububele. So Ububele provides parent-infant psychotherapy. We found that to be quite vital within our work, and so we engaged with them, got training, and started doing the work ourselves. And this was really building the attachment relationship. We were working with moms who had newborn babies, and parent-infant psychotherapy works the first 1,000 days of a baby's life. And so working on that relationship, building the, how does one respond to the emotional needs, promoting the healthy attachment in those first few years of life. And then also on the level of couples therapy, so working with couples in terms of building communication and creating spaces for empathy. So when we think about the family system, and you've got, the parents and the subsystems, we were looking at how do we build that space of communication and strengthen it, create spaces for empathy, holding and healing. And a lot of parenting skill development was done within that space. And then lastly, just moving on to the family. So this is where we would bring the whole family in and create a space for processing of narratives. So we were acknowledging that there might be a shared narrative, or there might be bits and pieces or fragmented narratives. How do we create a space where the family can express those narratives that they hold and make a picture, in a sense, of this collective experience that is really transgenerational. And in the space, really working with members to be able to recognize, right, and cope with a range of emotions that are coming up within the room. And so through mirroring the sense of all emotions are welcome, they can be held, they can be acknowledged, and working with the family to then be able to take that within their family system space, and not only seeing it as part of the therapist role, but really skills that they can embody as well. And also establishing boundaries within the family, healthy boundaries. So trying to reorganize, right? So we're saying relearn, rebuild the family system in spaces where there is parentification. Are you able to hold your needs and respond to others, but mindful of, if someone's 14 years old, how do I engage with that in a healthy way, in a way that, it's age appropriate, in a sense. So thank you, Berta. I'm going to stop there.
Thank you, Sumaiya. Thank you for this excellent presentation, clear, and for me it was also very easily to understand and follow. I hope it has been like that for everyone. Now we will leave some space for questions, if there are questions or comments. I guess after this, it has been enough emphasized, right? That the way these traumas are handled is crucial for the whole family dynamic. I see a hand up from Alexis. Hi, Alexis. Bonjour.
Bonjour.
Bonjour, Alexis. Est-ce que vous posez
Dans
une
un premier
question?
temps, oui. Bon, d'abord, c'est une petite remarque. On avait un problème de vous capter, de vous voir. On ne sait pas si c'était dû de votre côté là-bas. Ma question réside au point que, bon, j'ai bien suivi le premier intervenant sur les problèmes traumatiques. Il a parlé comment ça affecte les enfants, juste au niveau d'abord du comportement des parents. Bon, si le parent arrive à ne pas satisfaire les besoins des enfants, ça affecte les enfants et puis ça crée beaucoup de choses au sein de psychologie des enfants. Alors, moi, je me pose la question, si ces comportements, par exemple, le comportement financier, l'enfant a besoin de quelque chose et que les parents ne sont pas en mesure de payer la chose que l'enfant demande, est-ce qu'il n'y a pas un système qu'on peut appliquer pour faire voir cet enfant que les parents n'ont pas fait ça volontairement, c'est par manque d'argent, par exemple. Bon, ma deuxième question, on a dit que les phénomènes traumatiques affectent jusqu'au niveau de l'utérus, affectent l'enfant qui est au niveau de l'utérus. Et alors, bon, moi, je n'ai pas bien compris cette intervention. Et comment le problème traumatique peut faire à ce que l'enfant qui est au niveau du sein de sa mère soit affecté. Bon, et si l'enfant qui est au sein de sa mère est affecté à la naissance, quelles seront les conséquences de cet enfant une fois né et puis affecté à travers le sein de sa maman par le traumatisme? C'est ça la question.
Merci, Alexis. Sumaiya, I'm not sure if you are on the English channel and you got the translation.
I am on the English channel.
Yeah. If you want to go ahead and respond, or you prefer to take other questions.
I think let me respond as we go, because I don't get overwhelmed with questions. Thank you so much, Alexis. I think one of the, just in terms of the trauma impacting in utero, so what we're looking at there is the trauma response, right? So when we think about hypervigilance, and this links a lot to what trauma does to our body. So for example, when someone experiences a trauma, we have the amygdala, which is our survival brain that kicks in. When our survival brain kicks in, there is mechanisms within our body, neurotransmitters, cortisol, adrenaline. There's a whole lot of stuff that starts pumping to get us to survive. The stuff where it says you run faster, your pupils dilate. Our body moves into this gear to help us to survive. But what we notice within that is when we are experiencing hypervigilance, when we are triggered, for example. So for example, let's say I'm past the trauma event, right? I'm pregnant and I hear this loud bang in the street as I'm walking, and that triggers for me a memory that was linked to the trauma event. Physically, my body is in turn going to respond, and it's the same stuff. Your cortisol levels, your adrenaline level, that what happens within the body. And I mean, people often speak about heart racing, palpitations, getting hot or cold, not depending on the weather. So there's a response that is happening. The baby in essence, feeds off the mother, right? So these hormones that are being released at that point, it also is within your bloodstream, and it is fed or it engages with the baby through the placenta. I think even think about tightening. So when you feel highly stressed or you feel anxious, feel how your body just, kind of restricts or it tightens. That is also felt. And what research shows is the impact that that has is then one on the central nervous system or the automatic nervous system and on the limbic system. And these are our processing systems. And so we find that with children, and this is not in all cases, this is not kind of like every single person, right? But what we can find and research has shown is there's a vulnerability to anxiety. Gabor Martin, I'll put his name in the chat, speaks a lot to these in utero experiences where individuals in later life come and, it's kind of like, I'm struggling with anxiety issues, but tracing the source, it's a challenge because it's like, but I've always been like this. I don't really know where this is coming from for me. So how does those experiences in the womb affect how a child is, kind of, I don't want to say shaped and formed, but is influenced as well within that space as they are developing. I think about one of the clients that when she had her baby, there was, this child was very restless. I think that, like, just very, very restless. It was struggling to, to calm the child down. She kept on complaining. She felt the baby was colic. And so just that, the temperament, so to say, is what I'm referring to. And what we noted is we had seen mom through her pregnancy and high levels of anxiety. She had experienced a mugging. She had experienced a relationship conflict. And in those moments, just thinking about kind of her survival mode kicking in, what that meant for her body biologically, and how it could have impacted the child. So I think that's one area. The other question around financial challenges, I think really it's more about communication, I think, because what we're talking about here is really the unintended consequences, right? So a parent is not doing this to their child because they want to. It is unprocessed trauma, not knowing how the trauma has impacted on them, and then also not knowing that they are impacting their child in this way through the way that they engage. And attachment is not how shall I say, it's not held up on finances. I mean, we dealt with cases where there was nothing. The kids are getting just bread for lunch. But looking at what it means for a child to engage in a safe space, to be in a safe world with a safe attachment, it was looking at that relationship where when the attachment was secure, when mom was able to regulate her child, we would see something very, very different. It's like, I only have bread for you, and how the child would respond to that versus when the attachment was, disorganized, anxious, ambivalent, unsafe. The aspect of not having more than just bread for lunch exacerbates what's already in the space of the space can't be trusted. The adults within my space can't be trusted. But when the relationship and the attachment is secure, the other things become much more, let's say the other things I'm referring to, the external challenges, becomes more negotiable and is not directly linked to the sense of passing on trauma.
Thank you so much, Sumaiya. I hope Alexis got his questions responded or addressed. I can see 3 hands. Rusbla, Nava, and Shai. Maybe we can take them in order. And then I'm thinking Kahoe and Basant, you made some questions. Alexis, I'm gonna mute you.
Bertha, est-ce que je peux terminer avec mon intervention au moins?
Oh, okay.
Oui. Bon, je voulais seulement demander, après avoir suivi la réponse donnée par l'intervenant, bon, est-ce que, bon, toujours dans le problème de traumatisme au niveau de l'utérus, quoi, est-ce que ça arrive de fois où l'enfant est né avec un certain nombre de malformations? C'était ça ma question.
Ah, okay. Sumaiya, so I don't know if you got the translation for that, but he's asking about malformations. Yes. You can answer to that very briefly, because then
yes, I mean, Alexis, I can't answer that. In terms of the child born with kind of what I'm understanding is maybe deformities. So yeah, no, I don't know of any link of that. I think just to also say, right, so the presentation was really focused also on highlighting how it's transferred. And I think something that I should have included was also looking at, there's a number of protective factors that are also in place. We often talk about the attachment village, right? So that it's not just one caregiver. When individuals are placed within a space where there is support. So we think about moms with postpartum depression, for example. And then we look at what is around you, right? What are the systems in place that can provide support so that it's not just hinging on one person, which is the primary caregiver. It's a lot of responsibility, but we have the attachment village within the space that can also teach the child how to regulate, can also teach the child around the safety of the space and of the world. And I think that also speaks to how we think about, you know, transgenerational healing, how we think about building resilience within spaces. So Rizla, do you want to go next?
Yeah, feel free to go next.
Yeah, no, I think in a way you kind of did answer my question, because it was more in terms of whether you would see differences depending on the setup where they're living, like whether it's like, say, a nuclear setup, or whether if there's a lot more, say, extended family and other support there. So I think in a way you kind of did answer the question that I was curious about. So thank you. And I just wanted to say that the presentation was really informative and it was like very clear. So thanks a lot for.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rosla. And I think the Ainala, if I say your name correctly, go ahead.
Allô?
Allô?
Hello?
On vous écoute.
Allô, vous m'entendez?
Oui.
Merci, je voulais féliciter la présentatrice de l'exposé que je trouve très intéressante et j'aimerais rebondir sur la question discutée entre les deux participants, à savoir Alexis. Donc, je peux partager une expérience que nous avons sur la transmission intergénérationnelle du trauma. Dans notre travail, nous avons eu à couvrir des zones de réfugiés qui étaient des déportés de la Mauritanie. Et lors de la déportation, il y avait des groupes de femmes qui étaient violées et qui avaient subi beaucoup de violences. Et nous avons remarqué au fil des années que les femmes qui étaient enceintes et qui avaient subi la déportation avec beaucoup de torture, beaucoup de violence, les enfants qui sont nés après développaient des troubles mentaux. Et ces femmes étaient réparties dans plusieurs villages différents. Et à chaque fois qu'on allait dans un village, on voyait ces enfants nés après la déportation qui avaient des troubles de comportement. Et quand nous avons discuté avec les familles, au début, il y avait une réticence. On ne voulait pas parler de ce qui s'était passé. Mais après, les femmes nous ont révélé le récit. Certaines étaient violées pendant qu'elles étaient enceintes, d'autres étaient capturées comme esclaves sexuelles dans les camps des militaires. Et après, nous avons compris que peut-être cette transmission du trauma peut-être est passée par le corps de la femme et a atteint le fœtus, et ça a eu une répercussion sur l'enfant à la naissance. Maintenant, ce qu'on a pensé, et je pense qu'il est fondamental, c'est de faire la prévention, de discuter du trauma avec les générations à venir. Parce qu'en général, on cache ça. On pense que c'est une honte, un tabou. Et dans certaines communautés, on pense que même c'est le karma, parce qu'ils ont péché et que l'enfant a été victime du péché. Donc, c'est ça que je voulais ajouter comme contribution à l'exposé sur faire la nécessité de faire la prévention en parlant du traumatisme chez les générations à venir. Merci.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you so much, Dienava, for your insights. It's true that we always observe, right, these layers when there's sexual violence, these layers of shame, let's say taboo around the incident, so that makes it even harder, I guess, on the treatment of that trauma. But Dienava, she's bringing this attention to the prevention aspect, which we're not speaking so much about today, but yet important. I'm just a bit concerned about the time. I can see, Shai, you have a question, but I wanted to ask, is it okay if we leave it for the end, to leave some space for the speakers?
Yeah.
Good. Perfect. We'll get back to you. So I'm gonna now introduce the next wonderful speaker. Thank you so much, Sumaiya, again. So the next speaker we have with us is Elizabeth Coronado. She's a clinical psychologist at Fundación Priva in Ecuador. Elizabeth, si me escuchas, el micrófono es tuyo. Perfecto. Y voy a compartir la pantalla.
Gracias por la invitación. Reciban un cordial saludo de parte de la Fundación para la Rehabilitación de Víctimas de Violencia Priva Ecuador. Mi nombre es Elizabeth Coronado, soy psicóloga clínica. Me siento muy contenta de poder compartir nuestra experiencia dentro de nuestro trabajo de campo. El día de hoy vamos a hablar sobre la violencia intergeneracional en niños víctimas de mujeres víctimas de tortura. Es un tema que va muy relacionado con lo que nos ha comentado Sumaiya. En este caso, nosotros tenemos que entender algunos antecedentes para poder comprender realmente la situación de la cual son parte estos niños que nacen de estas mujeres que han sido torturadas. El equipo del área de rehabilitación de la Fundación Priva trabaja con víctimas de tortura en prisión desde el año 1996 y en el Centro de Rehabilitación Prioritario para Mujeres Pichincha número 3 desde el año 2013. Lugar en el que permanecen mujeres privadas de libertad, entre ellas víctimas de tortura, embarazadas o en periodo de lactancia con niños de 0 a 3 años de edad. En su mayoría, estos niños son concebidos y nacen dentro del mismo sistema carcelario. Para entrar en contexto, en Ecuador actualmente hay 35,000 personas privadas de libertad, de las cuales el 6% de la población son mujeres, que se encuentran alojados en 3 centros: Saquicilí, que es en la parte centro-norte del país, Turi, en la región austral, y Guayaquil, en la parte central del país. De acuerdo a los datos oficiales, la incidencia de violación en mujeres privadas de libertad es del 17.4%. El rango de edad de la población femenina mayoritariamente es entre los 18 y 29 años de edad, siendo esta una población joven. El sistema penitenciario no tiene una visión de género, siendo las leyes y el trato igual para hombres y mujeres, a pesar de estar embarazadas. Las mujeres son doblemente estigmatizadas socialmente por su condición, en primer lugar por ser mujeres y luego por haber transgredido la ley. Son mujeres que provienen de hogares desorganizados, que abandonan el hogar a tempranas edades, que han sufrido violencia intrafamiliar, bajos niveles de educación, con procesos de callejización y con niveles de subocupación e informalidad. Tomando en cuenta este contexto, nosotros podemos hablar que estas mujeres son físicamente maltratadas, psicológicamente vulneradas, están sufriendo su propio trauma ante la tortura y al mismo tiempo están pasando su proceso de embarazo. Por lo tanto, presentan ansiedad, pensamientos recurrentes sobre el trauma, temores nocturnos, alteraciones del sueño, alteraciones en las sensopercepciones, especialmente auditivas. Por lo tanto, es constante el flashback con relación a la tortura que ellos han sufrido. ¿Cuáles son las condiciones de vida? Estas situaciones generan entonces un desarrollo inadecuado en sus condiciones de vida. Observamos que las madres son inestables en la crianza de sus hijos, se encuentran la mayor parte del tiempo irritables, son impulsivas ante cualquier estímulo estresor que se presenta en su entorno. Las diferencias en sus hábitos y costumbres dentro de celda, a pesar de que en su mayoría son ecuatorianas o mujeres latinas, difiere por pertenecer a diferentes regiones del país, generando conflictos frecuentes. En estas condiciones se desarrollan los niños que son producto de una violación, de embarazos no deseados y de faltas en los anticonceptivos de la salud que provee el gobierno, como por ejemplo inyecciones que se encuentran caducadas. No hay una política de prevención en salud para el control del embarazo que sea apropiada para este tipo de población. Los niños son víctimas secundarias de la violencia entre madres y mientras estos se desarrollan, aprenden a generar una violencia entre pares. Existe un total abandono estatal. No cubre las necesidades de los niños, a pesar de que existe un centro de desarrollo infantil dentro de este centro carcelario. Este no provee o no cubre las necesidades básicas de los niños, como es en salud, no tienen la medicación. En lo que es el centro de atención no hay estimulación temprana, por lo tanto, los vulnera aún más. ¿Cuáles son entonces las consecuencias tempranas? Tomando en cuenta aquello que Sumaiya nos había mencionado y las preguntas que hemos tenido de las personas que nos acompañan en esta mañana, me gustaría compartir qué es lo que nosotros hemos visto directamente dentro del centro. Hemos observado que las consecuencias tempranas son el bajo peso al nacer, mayor incidencia de enfermedades digestivas, respiratorias, dermatológicas, bajo desarrollo pondoestatural, bajo desarrollo psicomotor y de lenguaje, baja estimulación temprana por parte de las madres, deprivación afectiva, bajo tiempo útil que dedica la madre a su hijo, afectación por la prisionización de la cual son sujetos a pesar de no haber cometido ningún delito, están obligados a permanecer con sus madres por la necesidad de sobrevivir. Como consecuencias a corto plazo, hemos podido observar en nuestro trabajo de campo que presentan algunos factores estresores como temor al abandono, separación del vínculo materno, dificultades en el sueño, sobresaltos, pesadillas, desórdenes alimentarios, dificultades en la socialización. Es decir, tenemos unos síntomas que nos van a dar una ansiedad temprana. ¿Por qué debemos atender a estos niños que son víctimas de una tortura intergeneracional? Si tomamos en cuenta lo que hemos hablado en esta mañana, estos niños son doblemente violentados. El uno por permanecer en un centro privado de libertad, donde están privados de todas las necesidades básicas, y también el tener que enfrentar la violencia intergeneracional de sus madres. Es importante por cuanto en esta etapa de la vida se produce la madurez del sistema nervioso central, por lo que el cerebro de un infante tiene la capacidad de absorber información hasta los 2 años de edad 2 veces más que el cerebro de un adulto, siendo más sensible y teniendo también la capacidad de modificarse. Atenuar el retraso psicomotor que implican los cambios de habilidades motrices, cognitivas, emocionales, sociales de los niños. Construye el conocimiento sobre el ambiente que lo rodea. Es la etapa que marca el cambio desde la dependencia de un lactante hasta la independencia de un adulto. En esta etapa adquiere habilidades motoras que son necesarias para la supervivencia, el lenguaje para comunicarse con su entorno, toma conciencia sobre sí mismo, autorregula sus emociones y el comportamiento que es necesario para integrarse a la sociedad. Para corroborar esta información, nosotros como equipo Priva hemos realizado una evaluación del desarrollo con el test de Denver a los niños de 0 a 3 años de edad en el año 2022 del Centro de Rehabilitación Social Prioritario para Mujeres Pichincha número 3, en los cuales nosotros hemos podido observar lo siguiente. Estos niños presentan déficit en el área personal social, motriz fina y lenguaje. Sin embargo, en el área motriz gruesa se encuentran dentro de la edad o con 1 mes por delante de la media. Esto debido a la negligencia del ambiente, a su necesidad de movilizarse para buscar el calor y protección de su madre ante el ambiente agresivo entre pares, que se encuentran dentro de celda, siendo utilizado este movimiento motor grueso como una estrategia de afrontamiento. A continuación, vamos a observar un pequeño video en el cual la CNN en español tuvo un contacto directo dentro de nuestro centro al cual nosotros presentamos nuestros servicios y podemos observar la opinión de las madres con relación a los síntomas que presentan sus hijos en el momento en que tienen la posibilidad de salir y compartir con sus familias y retornar nuevamente al centro.
Estoy aquí por un error que cometí en la vida. Para mí ha sido muy duro estar aquí, pero les demuestro que soy una mejor persona. Salir de aquí y seguir la universidad. Quiero ser abogada.
Cometí muchos errores, pero aquí estamos pagando nuestros errores. pero uno de esos, nuestros hijos no tienen que pagar por nuestras culpas. Hay niños que han salido de aquí y vuelven a entrar, o sea, es como que ellos entran con un pánico volver a este lugar.
Yo quisiera que aquí nos permitieran que nuestros hijos salgan y puedan estar con sus familiares, porque no solamente somos nosotros, afuera hay un padre, afuera hay una madre, afuera hay una abuela, afuera hay un hermano, y aquí ellos también son presos. Quiero que nos ayuden a reintegrarnos a la sociedad, eso quiero. Queremos que aquí nos den oportunidades, que nos preparen para el futuro, que nos preparen para salir de aquí y no seguir siendo personas que, ¿cómo les explico?, que no sepamos qué hacer.
Y salida de las nuevas bachilleres a cargo de
Ahí está. Muchas gracias, Elizabeth. Muchas gracias por la presentación.
Si hay alguna inquietud.
Sí. Es decir, so now we can open some space for some questions after Elizabeth's presentation. I hope you could all get the interpretation through, also from the video. Otherwise, maybe I will invite Shai.
Okay, maybe it's irrelevant, I'm not sure. What I wanted to ask, we talked a lot about the triggers and we talked about the anxiety triggers. I wonder what about the effect of the emotional trigger, which is very common in a complex PTSD when you feel, I think the best I heard about theoretically was from Pete Walker, but it's when it's very like the normal anxiety triggers, but what you feel mostly, it's more common. You feel very deep into some kind of emotion. Can be very deep depression, but it can be very, very sudden. Sometimes people does not know the source of it, exactly like the anxiety normal triggers. So I wonder if you talk because specifically about attachment, I think it's very, very relevant to think also about the emotional triggers and not just the normal stuff. So I wonder maybe someone would want to share something about it because I wonder about it.
Yeah, thank you, Shai. I think though Sumaiya did mention some of those emotional triggers in her presentation.
Yes, a bit.
No, yeah. But I don't know, Beatrice, Elizabeth, if you want to say something about those specific emotional triggers that Shai is mentioning.
Yes, and specifically how to talk about people about them mostly because I think I found it a bit harder to explain those stuff, I think, to people.
You mean how it is explained or how you engage with it in?
About engaging, but also I think part of engaging is to talk about the psychoeducational level, to talk about a person, what is going on in his body and stuff. So I wonder how to engage about it because it is a bit more for me, at least, to explain to people than the normal stuff.
Yeah. Elizabeth, no sé si quieres responder a eso.
Claro. Es muy importante tomar en cuenta cómo se va formando el constructo, tanto dentro de lo que es el temperamento y el carácter, desde la formación de los niños. Podemos observar cómo la madre, desde que está ya embarazada, puede absorber todas las situaciones que se encuentran en su ambiente y estos estímulos estresores son absorbidos por el bebé, por su niño, desde que está en el vientre. Cuando nace, la primera persona que necesita para poder sobrevivir es su madre. Y por medio de la alimentación que ella le provee a su hijo, por medio de la lactancia, ya está creando un apego a su madre, una necesidad de su madre. Luego, en sus primeros meses de vida, necesita el calor, necesita la protección, necesita el cuidado de su madre. Sin embargo, en la parte psicológica, sus madres están prácticamente con una atención en otro lugar. La atención en las situaciones que tienen que pasar de resolución de sus propios conflictos, de sus propios traumas. Por lo tanto, esto hace que exista un abandono hacia el cuidado del niño. Este niño ya empieza a tener una inestabilidad con relación a su apego. No hay un apego saludable. Se vuelven niños más irritables a medida de que van creciendo, con temores, con temor al abandono de su madre, porque ésta no le está prestando la atención que el niño necesita. Es importante también en esta etapa el área de socialización. Sin embargo, en la situación en la cual los niños se están desarrollando, no existe una socialización adecuada. El niño se encuentra sensible. Existe una relación de rivalidad entre los niños e incluso entre las madres dentro de celda. Esto provoca que los niños no desarrollen un apego incluso con sus propios padres ni sus pares, ¿no? Entonces nos damos cuenta que es muy importante tomar en cuenta desde dónde nace la raíz de absorber la violencia, tanto de la madre como ser partícipes de cómo se forma la violencia en los niños, cómo ellos son parte de esta violencia, ¿no? Entonces, si tomamos en cuenta que nuestro cerebro tiene una plasticidad, la intervención de nosotros debe ser temprana, debe ser pronta, porque así como ellos se van marcando de todos estos traumas, también si el ambiente puede ser modificado, estos niños pueden aprender a tener nuevas imágenes que sean más saludables y puedan atenuar los traumas por los cuales están pasando o se han desarrollado.
Muchas gracias, Elizabeth. Creo que ya vamos a pasar sorry, I think we're gonna move on to the last but not least speaker, Alex Kigoye. He's a program manager at ACTV Uganda. Alex, I can see you.
Thank you so much, Bata, and all the previous speakers for that well-elaborated explanations that have been given when it comes to intergenerational trauma. And for sure, I'll not go back into the explanations of the science of the intergenerational trauma. And I think this topic is really, really very timely for us to discuss about intergenerational trauma, and mainly with a focus on children. So today, I just want to share with us just some few reflections when it comes to integration mainly of child care services in relationship to rehabilitation, as taking into consideration that intergenerational trauma, when it comes to children, it has a very big impact. So from our experience at the African Center for Treatment and Rehabilitation of Torture Victims, we have been providing rehabilitation services to victims of torture for the last 30 years. But it came to us that there is a gap when it comes to addressing children, and more so children that have suffered trauma and whose parents have suffered trauma as well. I'll give you an example that it happened once. A child came to us, a 3-year child, and she was given a doll, and she held this doll and she wrapped the doll's eyes. then we asked this child, why are you doing this? She told us, you see, my father, when they were arresting him and beating him, they rubbed his eyes. So I'm doing this because I'm remembering what happened. Another one came to us, a 10-year child, told us, I'm very angry, and every time I look at the wounds of my father, I become angry and I want to join military just to revenge to those people that tortured and put scars to my father. So when you look at all of these are children that are suffering from trauma. And many times such symptoms and signs, we neglect them when it comes to rehabilitation. So it struck us and said, okay, it is high time to have a conversation and then be able to address such needs of children when it comes to rehabilitation. And as an organization, then we went out to do an assessment, and this was really a small assessment to help us understand the needs and then be able to find the feasibility for us to integrate these services. But as we're going through this conversation, then it came. And when we talk about trauma, and more so in this context of intergenerational trauma, it happened that when we were setting out to have this research, we really saw that the needs for these services, it all culminated from the so many children that have been tortured, but also the so many cases of torture around the country. And meaning that we had a total of an average of 1,000 survivors of torture that we see at the center annually, but 3% of these were children that are directly suffered trauma. And we had about 17% who were secondary survivors and were suffering from secondary trauma effects. And when you look at these, this is what now culminates into intergenerational trauma. But also we looked at that research around that also indicated that childhood trauma has enormous long-term effects that are emotional, health behaviors, among others that have been discussed. So when we did this assessment, we mainly wanted to look at what are the needs and gaps in terms of children who are survivors of torture, but also children, the survivors of torture that are direct survivors, but also those ones that are suffering from trauma as a secondary effect, but also those ones that where transference has been made. But since we wanted to look at integration, we wanted to look at what the feasibility measures that we need, or any centers can and need for them to be able to integrate these kind of services, but also to address the needs of children that have suffered from trauma as secondary survivors and where there is intergenerational trauma. So when we were going out, we carried out an assessment, and the tools that we were able to use, we did focus group discussions, looking at children, looking at parents who are survivors of torture, and also looking at the different service providers to just get a quick understanding of what the problem could be and the extent of the problem and what is really, really needed. We're able to do interviews, and then we're able to also do a document review at that level, understanding the systems and policies that surround children, but also surrounding the needs of children when it comes to intergenerational trauma. And what we found key to note was that torture among its children was very prevalent in communities. And one thing that we need to understand that in communities, when it comes to children, torture comes in different ways. And some of it has been a result of mothers, caregivers, also them suffering trauma. And as a means of transference, they have been now transferring instances of torture to their children. And this was a fact that we're able to find. And we found that children with protection needs and living with special needs are at a greater risk for torture. And we categorized parents who have gone through torture as parents that are, and those children that are in category of special needs. So when you look at parents that have suffered torture, their children at a very high risk of them even suffering torture, but also as a means of transference of trauma. And the one thing that we saw as a fact that there was a high level of trauma that is physical, psychological among its children, and that have suffered torture directly or indirectly. And children require tailored intervention to address their trauma, both direct trauma, but also the transferred trauma. So there was a need really to have tailored interventions that could address these needs of children that have suffered trauma, that have trauma being transferred to them. The one thing that we saw that traumatic events as experienced by children. We looked at direct survivors, but also we looked at indirect survivors. What are these traumatic experiences that children reported, parents reported? Of course, there are these direct experiences which have been mentioned, which we all know: brutal arrest and imprisonment of children, gender-based violence of children, corporal punishment in schools and homes, forced labor, child trafficking, and exposure to war. But we also looked at children who who witnessed torture of their guardian. Just like a story I've given of a child that looked at a father being arrested, and that one actually was registered into their mind. And it happens that every time they are visualizing this incident, they are visualizing how their father was arrested, how their father was blindfolded, how their father was beaten in front of them. And this is a 4-year child. So these graphic memories are registered into their minds, and they happen to live with them throughout their lives in the event that they are not addressed. A child that witnessed that is seeing scars on their father just because they went through torture, and this child is asking themselves, why did we have to go through this? Why does my father have to have this level of scars? And the child is anger incidences are triggered within them, and they want to revenge. They want to take action towards the people that they think they could be responsible for what their father is going through, for what their family is going through. So this is one thing that we saw. Transference of trauma effects from the parents to children. I've explained this, and the previous speakers also talking about this so elaboratively. And then we have seen the limitations in parental care and love. So you'll find that parents that have suffered torture, that have gone through traumatic experiences, they have deficiencies in providing parental care. They have deficiencies in showing love to their children. And in the end, the children, because of these dynamics now, they also re-experience trauma in that way. And also there's a whole thing of limitation of accessing to basic needs. And these children start to wonder, why should I lack when others don't lack? So at the end of the day, these experiences will trigger trauma, and then at the end of the day, children will live into this vicious cycle of trauma. So, and really, these ones have been discussed about that children will always suffer physical and psychologically and socially effects when it comes to trauma. There are physical injuries and diseases, especially those that have experienced direct trauma. But also it comes to the second trauma, that there will be high levels of distress, anxiety, child depression, anger, memory loss, social isolation, and aggressiveness. I think this is one thing that we have seen throughout, that intergenerational trauma, and more so in children, will always trigger distress, will always trigger anxieties, will always trigger depression, will always trigger anger. We have seen children coming here in our play center, and they are aggressive to each other. They are aggressive even to play toys, to toys. There is that level of aggressiveness. The whole thing of memory loss, loss of concentration in class, and poor performance in class all comes out as a result of this trauma. Social isolation as another thing that comes with intergenerational trauma. And these are the things that we saw in this mini assessment that we did, as we were triggered to say there is a need to look into children and intergenerational trauma. Of course, children always lived in fear of being tortured again or losing their caregivers. So you find that like a child that I've just talked about, they saw their parents being tortured and being taken away, being arrested. Always they are in fear that one time my parents will be taken away. There is a time we interfaced with a child that their father, when they were being arrested, there is this big car that came to arrest them. And any car that would come to home, the child would be in panic. And this was a child of about 2 to 3 years. So any sound of a car would make the child panic. And the panic would come in because they think they are coming to take their father again. So this is what we saw, and this is what assessment gave us. But also, these are things that would see but give lift to us attention at that level. Of course, there is the whole loss of confidence and self-esteem among peers, aggressive behaviors. I've talked about the tendencies of self-harm and harming of others, and leading to dysfunctional families. You find that children neglect their families, parents neglect their families just because of this trauma that has happened and affected children and other caregivers. So, of course, these are other indirect findings that we got. High rate of school dropout, stigma and discrimination, family breakdown and separation, and of course the whole thing of limited access to basic needs as another result that we saw that results into from all these traumatic events that are experienced by different caregivers. Now, of course, we looked at what could be the rehabilitation needs that children may need. Of course, there is a whole bit of medical treatment for physical illness, tailored to children, psychological and emotional support. And the whole discussion ever since we started, it has been about the psychological and emotional needs of children arising from the intergenerational trauma that is experienced. And out of this assessment as an organization at ACTV, the number of interventions that we're able to come up with, of course, some of them have been talked about, but we looked at mainly the intervention when it comes to family support and family therapy. It was very, very fundamental, explaining the trauma to the family, which was very, very critical. Being able to bring everyone, including children, including the adults in the home, explaining to them this kind of trauma that they are going through. It's an intervention that is very, very critical, but we found that it's very, very relevant when it comes to addressing incidences of intergenerational trauma, but also being able to foster communication and cohesion within family. Because one thing that we saw that comes out in intergenerational trauma is the disruption in communication, is the cutout on communication. Either the communication will be in a manner that is inappropriate, or it will be totally cut. So the intervention of therapy at family level was mainly focusing on how do we build communication? How do we ensure that there is communication and proper and appropriate communication, really to be able to address this kind of intergenerational trauma, which we found that was really, really working once the families are able to communicate and able to understand each other in an appropriate way. Then parental love would come back. Then understanding among each other would come back, and then it will help in addressing some of the traumatic experience or the behaviors or the effects that would have come. Of course, educational needs, then there are children that would need a placement, relocation, mostly those at risk. Because we saw one of the things that comes out of intergenerational trauma and puts children, as we saw that children that have been in these families, they are so much at risk because there is a change in behavior of parents and caregivers. You find that some of them become more aggressive, become more intolerant. So sometimes you may find that there is a need to have intervention that relocate or put the child who is at risk in a different, to remove them from an experience that is both traumatic, and then you work with these caregivers to ensure that the situation comes back to normalcy. Of course, intervention to do with parental love, I've talked about it, and then play for children, which are very, very vital. And this is a center that we're able to establish at our center, to have a playroom for children, for them to be able to address the so many traumatic experience and memories that they have gone through. Of course, the whole thing of interventions to address self-esteem and self-awareness, where we talk with children, raise their awareness, ensure that we give them soft skills when it comes to self-expression, self-confidence. All these are some of the interventions, and also to foster resilience around them. So one of the things that probably we need to consider, of course, now comes at the programmatic level, and also when we are thinking about really, really integrating. One thing is about policies and policy framework to provide or cater for aspects of children and caregivers and safeguarding children. You see, many times, most of the centers are focusing on the primary survivor, who could be the caregiver or the parent. And when it comes to children, it means that you need now to rethink how and have even relevant policies and framework really to address the needs of children, because you find that the way you are going to address children, you need more protection policies, safeguarding policies within your organization or your institution. But also it comes to the whole bit of capacity from the experience that Sumaiya and then Elizabeth gave, dealing with the intergenerational trauma, but also focusing on children. It's a whole set of skills different from the way we handle adult survivors. So you'll find that you need to build capacity within your institution, the capacity of your staff, the capacity of your systems to be able to address the needs of children, and also focusing on intergenerational trauma, but also the whole environment of the rehabilitation centers, the levels of convenience, the levels of privacy, to have child-centered and child-friendly centers that meet the trauma needs of children. The whole thing about monitoring and evaluation, what are our indicators, what are our tools that we use in ensuring that we address specific needs of children, we address the needs, the well-being of children when it comes to trauma, but also looking at the government policies, what the government policies say. For example, here, when it comes to address in Uganda, when it comes to an institution working with children, you have to work with a government database. So what do country policies say when it comes to protection of children, and how do you integrate that? Of course, the whole thing of availability of resources. So you will see that some of these interventions need resources specifically tagged to addressing the needs of children. So this is at the feasibility level, that if we are assessing feasibility at a programmatic level, what are the things and issues that we may need to look at for us to be able to integrate children or to address intergenerational trauma within our rehabilitation services. So in a nutshell, as I'm concluding, these are some of the words that we need to reflect on. I found these words when someone said them, that trauma in a person decontextualized over time looks like their personality. Indeed, if trauma is normalized, we start thinking this is someone's personality. So we shall say that person is aggressive. That is how he behaves. He isolates himself, is a quiet person, and we think this is their personality, but it comes out of trauma. And the same says that trauma in a family, decontextualized over time, looks like a family trait. That's when we say that really that family, they are aggressive people. That family, they are insensitive people. That family, so it looks like a trait. And when you look at intergenerational trauma, when we normalize this, when we decontextualize this and think this is normancy, then these are some of the results. We may think now these are family traits. But now when it comes to the society and we say trauma in a people, decontextualized over time, it looks like a culture. And we don't want to build a culture of traumatic people. We don't want to build a culture of aggressive people. We don't want to build a culture of depressed people, of people suffering from PTSD. And that's why this conversation becomes very, very crucial and very, very important. With that, thank you so much. Unless there are questions or any other contributions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alex. I think also ending on that quote, very important, right? To remind the meso and macro levels of not addressing trauma, and especially from the very beginning. I think there was actually a question from Zahrech. I don't know if I'm pronouncing Zohrech. his name, I don't know if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, but yeah, he had a comment on, you know, what happens if this is not addressed at an early stage, but it's addressed, for example, when the person is 40 years old. I'm really mindful of the time now. We have gone way beyond the time. I can still see a couple of questions. I'm thinking maybe we can take one question. The other ones, I have been noting them on my notes, and I will get back to you on email. But maybe we can take William's question since Alexis has had time to speak. And otherwise, I think we'll have to close here. Yes, I'm aware that we have.
Oh, hello.
Oh,
hello.
Hello. Hello.
Okay, thank you very much, Bata. My question is because there is normally there's normally, or it's normally a bit challenging for me to define or to differentiate between intergenerational trauma and transgenerational trauma. Sorry, I joined this session much later after it had continued for several minutes, but I just want to know whether there is a difference between intergenerational trauma and transgenerational trauma. Thank you.
Thank you, William. I know, Alex, if you want to say something about it, but for what I heard, and as far as my research went, I think it's different ways of referring to the same thing. Am I correct? I also heard about co-victimization, secondary victimization.
Yes, and really you are right. And straight out from Sumaiya's presentation, we're able to be exposed to what intergenerational trauma is. And really there is a high, a high linkage and of these words. Really, it's just a semantics of words. Yeah.
Good, good. I think we'll have to close here because we went beyond the time. I'm sorry for the interpreters, but I'm really happy to see that you all hold kept your ears open until now. As I said, I will follow up on a couple of questions that have been popping up on the chat. But for now, we have this poll that we always launch at the end of the every session. I will launch it because I see my colleague Andrea says she can launch it, so I will just launch it quickly. You might see it in your screen now. This is basically 3 questions that will help us to keep providing these spaces and improving. I will also mention that these sessions are always recorded, and the recordings are uploaded in our e-learning site, Fabo. I'm sure my colleague Andrea will also share the link on the chat at the end. And yeah, we thank you all, and especially the presenters, Sumaiya, Alex, Elizabeth. It has been really wonderful. Elizabeth, ¿tienes la mano arriba? ¿Quieres hacer algún comentario? Maybe not. I can see you're all completing this short goal. Also, just to say, as you saw, we have programmed kind of a series, children webinar series, if you want to call it. So the specific focus on children. This was the first one of this series. The next one will be on the 27th of September. Then we have one in October and another one in November. And the one in December, it's actually, we will speak about how to document this type of ill treatment and torture in children as primary victims. So that one will be very much in line to what Pitambar was commenting in the chat, right? If there are any tools to document and measure that. But yeah, with that said, we'll wrap it up here. We thank you again so much, Elizabeth, Alex, Sumaiya. Thank you so, so much. And let's keep in touch. Adios, Yadira. Thank you, Alex.
Thank you. Thank you, Edo. Bye.
Thank you.
Adiós. Thank you, everyone.
Adiós, María.
Adiós, Berta.
Adiós. Hablamos. Bye, George.
Hablamos.
Juventina. Adiós. Muchas gracias. Elizabeth. María Ángeles.
¿Qué tal?
Gracias. Y bueno verte otra vez. Bueno,
igualmente.
Ya hablaremos.
Muchísimas gracias a todas. Ha sido maravilloso.
Qué bueno. Hola, Maudi también, de Guatemala.
Hola.
Qué rico veros
Qué
a
gusto
todos.
verlas. Nos vemos.
Sí, qué bueno. Nos vemos. Hi, Sophie. Cook.
Maudi.
Hola, Juventina.
Hola.
Saludos.
Gusto
Igual.
verte.
Adiós.
Adiós.
Thank you.
We'll just close it.